Okay, so this is where we left off yesterday. We had just talked about voiced and voiceless sounds, and now we're going to get back into talking about S and Z, or S and Z specifically. And we're going to talk about the spelling of those sounds. So it's not totally misleading in the spelling. So the Z sound is almost always represented by a written Z. So in all these sounds from zoo to fuzz, we have one or two Z's and they're pronounced Z. And similarly, one or two S's are typically pronounced S. So we see that from so to process on this list. Now we do run into a little trouble again with C. We talked about that with the velar stop K, but C can also be pronounced as this alveolar fricative S, and that's before I, E, and Y. So examples of each of those would be cell, city, and fancy. This does include, of course, silent E, like in entice or race. And another big problem, if you get stuck in the spelling, is that an S between vowels is typically Z. So we see that in all these words: pleasant, surprise, nose, nasal, rosy, composer. And again, even if that silent E is there, you still have to have a voiced sound there. So if someone asks you, what's the last sound in nose? Of course, you don't write E. We know that's silent. We talked about that in class. But we don't write S either. It's a Z, so we have to write a Z as the symbol for that sound. Very surprisingly, there are even some double S's that are pronounced Z in possess and desert, for example. And there are even words that change based on part of speech. So if I write U-S-E and say, what's the last sound in that? You don't actually know. So the verbs use the Z form. So use and close, but the non-verb forms, so the noun use and the adjective close, those use the voiceless forms. So the lesson, of course, is don't think too hard about the spelling. The spelling is just there to signal to you what word we're talking about, and then you think about how it actually sounds. Okay, we're going to look here at another fricative consonant. You can see the tongue has moved. It's no longer close to that alveolar ridge. This might even be representing the dental t, d of Spanish and many other languages. But the air is escaping through narrow gaps on either side of the tongue, so this is a fricative. So if this were class, I would ask you, what sound is shown here? And of course, you can answer now while you're watching this video. What sound is this? And I hope you are guessing that this is the two sounds represented by the TH of English spelling. It's also found in Arabic and Icelandic. Of course, we talked about in class how it's represented in European Spanish as well. At least one of them is. So this is the voiceless and the voiced V. The nicknames for these symbols are theta and ev. To me, it's handy that the voiced one, ev, looks like a D, which is the voiced one. And the voiceless one, theta, I wouldn't say it looks like a T, but it's got that same crossbar down the middle like a T. And you can think someone who didn't have theta or ev in their English might pronounce a T and a D. So they would say this thing instead of this thing. So this thing would have a D and a T in them. When you write the symbol for ev, don't write a D though. You can see it's more like a backward 6 with a cross through it. So these sounds are somewhat restricted in English, not totally. So at the beginning, if you see a TH at the beginning of a word, it's typically theta. So thing, thought, throat, with, math, both. All of those are voiceless. And we have a V before ER or a silent E. Father, mother, weather, either, loathe, bathe. We do also see a lot of V at the beginning of function words. So the, this, that, those, they, them, their, thus, then. So if you were to pronounce these with thetas, this, that, those, they, them, their, thus, then. Those are not how we pronounce those words in English. So we need to use the voiced one there. We've moved again. The tongue is in resting position, but there's something going on in the front of the mouth. So frication in this case happens when the air passes through the narrow gap between the bottom lip and teeth. So this is the labiodental fricative. Of course, by now you're not surprised to hear we have two, a voiced and a voiceless one. So you can guess, you can put your lip against your top teeth, just like in the picture, and exhale and see what sound it makes. And I hope the sound you got was voiceless f and voiced v. And again, these symbols are almost exactly what you'd hope. The one word people sometimes get tripped up on is of, which is always, even though it's spelled with the voiceless letter, it's transcribed and pronounced with the voiced sound. There are some words that switch from F to V when they go plural, but this is shown in the spelling, so it shouldn't be too surprising. Wife, wives, leaf, leaves. And there's one more I want to talk about, but if you look at the articulatory diagram here, it looks like, aside from the velum being back, this is a mouth at rest. So what's actually going on here is we're making the frication in the voice box, the place where we usually do voicing. So the muscles in the voice box, I said, are called the vocal folds or vocal cords. And there's an opening between them that's called the glottis. So the glottis is the hole, the glottis is empty space, and the vocal folds, those are the muscles. Sometimes people get a little confused about that. The glottis is the hole, the vocal folds are the actual body parts. But because we're changing the size of the glottis, this last fricative is called a glottal fricative. And it's hard to think about what you're doing with your glottis, but you can guess now what you think that is. It's the fricative H. And it's voiceless because the vocal folds cannot really vibrate and fricate at the same time. Now, some languages do have something that is basically a voiced glottal fricative, some languages of Northern India, for example. But if you really look closely at what's happening, they're sort of very quickly alternating between voicing and fricating in the voice box. But those sounds are uncommon because that's tricky to do, and you don't find them in many languages, and we don't have it in English. So if we have an H sound, we always write an H. But there are, of course, silent H's that we don't say. So honor, herbivore, honesty. We don't, if you were asked for the first sound in those words, of course, you're going to transcribe the vowel sound, which we'll talk about in our next class. This frication that we do is also what makes aspiration on voiceless stops. We talked briefly about that in class yesterday, but we'll talk more about it when we get to our phonology unit. But that's what makes our quote unquote voiceless stops in English. That's what really distinguishes them. In class yesterday, I used the example of the word Latino. If we say the word Latino, like an American, you'll have that T sound with a little bit of H, whereas the Spanish T is not voiced, but it also doesn't have this frication after it. There's no aspiration, so it's Latino, no H heard. So we've covered a lot yesterday and today. We've covered most of the sounds of English so far. So first we looked at these three voiced and voiceless oral stops, which come in pairs. And we looked at their complementary nasal stops. And we learned one new symbol, the N with a hook, the engma. Its nickname is engma. And it is the equivalent of a G or a K, but the air escapes through the nose because the velum is forward. We then talked about all these fricative. We started with S and Z, the most common ones, and we also looked at the labiodental fricatives and V, the interdental fricatives and V, and the glottal fricative. And we talked about why there's no voiced glottal fricative. And we haven't had to learn too many new symbols yet. We had to learn the engma, the theta, and the ev. But you notice here, we have some sounds that all have unusual symbols. And the last thing I'm going to talk about in this video is those sounds, and these gray sounds down here. They actually have some similarities to vowels, and we'll talk about them on Monday. So we're going to talk now about the post-alveolar articulation. So remember, we just talked about S and Z, S and Z. They're pronounced with the tongue almost touching the alveolar ridge, like you see in that top picture there. The alveolar ridge, remember, is that bump behind the teeth. And we'll look now at two more fricatives, sh and zh. Those are articulated behind the post-alveolar ridge. Sorry, behind the alveolar ridge. That's a typo in the slides. Behind the alveolar ridge. And behind the alveolar ridge is what's called post-alveolar. I'll fix that when I upload these slides again. So the articulation of these post-alveolar sounds, the tongue is pressed close to where the alveolar ridge meets the palate. So instead of this bump here, it's sort of this depression here where the main frication happens. And remember, we talked about the palate. That's this long, flat part here. So there are palatal stops and fricatives in some languages. I say none of ours. Again, I forgot to check that with languages with people speak in this class. I think that some Slavic languages do have the palatal stop tr. If there's any German speakers, the word ich and nicht have a palatal fricative in them. But we don't have any palatal sounds in English, except for one we'll talk about on Monday, but certainly no stops and fricatives. So instead, we have these post-alveolar sounds that sort of take their place. And so we'll talk about some affricates. Affricates are two-part sounds. So the first step, you make a stop. It's very similar to a t or a d. And then immediately afterwards, you switch to one of those post-alveolar fricatives, sh and zh. And the symbols for those sounds, of course, are just the crammed together ligatures of two glyphs to make one. So now we'll look more in depth at everything I just said. So this is the voiceless post-alveolar fricative. It's the most commonly thought of as an SH sound and transcribed with this symbol. Make sure when you write it, you make it very dramatically tall. You could even just write an L and put ends on it. Sometimes people transcribe this in such a way that I cannot tell the difference between an S and an esh. And of course, that's in your interest to do. So its nickname is esh, but that can be confusing, especially over Zoom. So you can call this long S. And you might recognize it. It's, if you look at like the Declaration of Independence, this used to be how S's were written in the middle of words and at the beginning of words. So even though I said it's SH, we do have a lot of CH in English because we have influence from French where CH represents sh. So all these words, champagne, chandelier, chef, brioche, and mustache, those are all pronounced with a sh for a ch, not a ch. We also have a lot of internal sh that are the result of a process called palatalization. Remember, this is the palate up here. So TI, CI, SI, and SSI, everything from mission to special has a sh sound in the middle. And even SSU, for a different reason, can be pronounced sh. So we see that in sure to tissue. Okay, you notice the articulation hasn't changed here because we're talking about the voiced version. This is sometimes called ej. Students also often like to call this 3, which is fine because it does look like a 3. Notice it's not written up on the line, though. It's written with a descender like a G. That's the only difference. So we don't have any standard way to spell this in English. So all those arguments I gave you at the beginning of class on Thursday, you can add this. That the IPA gives us a way to talk about zh without writing ZH. And ZH is fine, but because it's like SH, but ZH does not appear in any English word, as far as I know. But zh is actually a pretty common sound in English. It's often an SI or an SU before other vowels. visual, usual, occasion, Asian, you can hear that zh sound in there. And for some speakers like me, at the end of words, when you have a GE, some of those are zh, like in French. So I say garage, barrage, triage, massage. Some of you might say garage, barrage, triage, massage. I've never heard triage, but maybe some of you say that. So if I ask you for the last sound here, it depends on your accent. Some of you will say j, and some of you will say j. We'll talk more about j in a moment. And that's one of those two-part sounds, affricates. So the tongue first touches behind the alveolar ridge, making a stop, and then it pulls back to make a fricative, as shown in this picture. So one English affricate, that's t plus sh, which is ch, that's the voiceless post-alveolar affricate. How do you think it sounds? If you put them together, you get the CH of English, and also Spanish. So cheese, chest, choose, rich, porch, belch. In Spanish, you hear it in like English borrowed words like chinchilla and churro, for example. And English spelling does recognize that the T is part of this sound, and we often write it not at the beginning of words, except in very marginal, like old-fashioned words borrowed from French, like the old spelling of the country Chad was TCHAD. We eventually dropped the T to be more like English. But at the end of words and in the middle of words, we do see a lot of TCH. And so that T is represented in the spelling. So in the sound in the middle of kitchen and satchel, and at the end of catch is the same as at the end of belch or the beginning of cheese. And again, it's a little tricky. Some TUs are also pronounced ch. You notice there's a little bit different distribution here. So for example, before RE, it's always ch, feature, picture, pasture, posture, and actual. I think it's the influence of the k before it that makes that be a ch and not a sh. But that's more an ESL worry than a worry for you, because you know how to pronounce these words already. You just have to recognize them. Okay, finally, we got that same articulation, but now we have a d plus a j. That's a voiced post-alveolar affricate. You can think about how those two sound together. We usually think of this as the J in English. So that's all these words, joke, majesty, etc. But actually, if you count English words that contain a j sound, it's usually written with a G, even though it's only before E, I, and Y. So gesture, general, energy, cringe, all those have the j sound in them, the same sound. And just like with ch, this stop part of the affricate is sometimes written. You might have heard of the movie Django, which is borrowed from French, where they put the D before the j, just like in Chad, and like in the country of Djibouti, where they write the D before the j to make j. In English, we only do that in the middle of words, sometimes with a J like adjust or adjacent, sometimes with a G like in badger and edge. And just like how ch could be a TU, j can be a DU, so graduate, education, fraudulent, those are all just sounds. Okay, so now we've covered a lot of our English consonants. We got those stops, oral and nasal. We got our first group of fricatives, and then we spent a little extra time on our post-alveolar fricatives because of the funny symbols and the irregularities of writing them. And so when we come to class on Monday, I will introduce these sounds. Some of them are very similar to vowels. Some of them are slightly similar to vowels. They are called sonorants because they have a little more energy, vocal cord energy associated with them. So I'll put them in there. And so now that you've watched this video, you should be ready to do the worksheet to practice recognizing sounds in English words.